gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together.
At the age of 9, a traumatic event brought me face to face with the disturbing realization about the fragility of life. That understanding ripped me open and exposed my monster that I would wrestle with and cower from, sidestep and face down in many different ways over the years. That monster was fear and anxiety. At the same time, that event and its aftermath blessed me and made me who I am, dark and light intertwined in confusing ways that I struggled with for decades, coming to terms and understanding it. Each one of us faces a key issue, that shadow side of our being that disconnects us from ourselves and from others. Some of you might share similar struggles with fear. Others maybe struggle with the obstacles of shame or guilt, self-criticism, greed, anger, self-consciousness, sexual struggles, lust, addiction, gender issues, and on and on. This fall, I took the position as the director of Coming of Age at First Unitarian. And these 9th graders who I brought with me today are spending a year exploring who they are and how they see themselves in relation to our Unitarian Universalist faith. They're naming and wrestling with some of life's big questions about self and others and relationships and the way the world works, and beginning to manage the intensity and the contradiction and the challenges that come with being human. It's that beginning stage of becoming an adult. One of the projects that this 9th grade group will be doing, actually starting this week, is called their Obstacle Project. They're going to look at a personal challenge and how that interferes with themselves and their practice of Unitarian Universalism, maybe disconnecting them from themselves or from other people or from the earth. And then we're going to create some kind of a tangible project to express that struggle, maybe writing or art or music or a PowerPoint presentation. In some of the past years, youth in this program have worked with struggles about body image and self-worth, fears of speaking up and having a voice, inability to listen to others and to hear the truth that others have to share, feeling disconnected and unable to fit, those struggles with belonging, losing oneself in relationship or going against one's values to fit in, or focusing on oneself and one's own needs without respect for others and the environment, or issues with addiction. So those are some of the things that they wrestled with. So I'm going to talk about this topic today because it doesn't just apply to these 9th graders, it applies to all of us. I've struggled with almost all of those topics in one way or another through my life. So this is a lifetime project. These 9th graders are merely starting the work this week. We first face our own monsters in different ways at different times in our life. Sometimes it's a traumatic event or a difficult situation that catapults us into facing whatever that obstacle is. Or sometimes that darker side of ourselves surfaces slowly, almost unnoticed over the years. The famous psychotherapist Carl Jung called that shadow side, that part of ourselves that society and our family cultures teach us to repress or to ignore, those unacceptable parts of ourselves. But repressing and ignoring actually feeds the beasts, because when those parts of ourselves are unacknowledged or pushed out of consciousness, they confine and they control us. The shadow limits our ability to function as complete and well-adjusted human beings unless we let it out into the light, acknowledge it, integrate it, even dance with it. Autumn is actually the perfect time to reflect on these dark parts of our souls. because now the days become shorter, the air colder, the outside world starts to match those hidden inner parts of ourselves. So as I share my own struggle, I invite you to use my story as kind of a springboard to reflect on whatever your own inner struggles are or have been, whatever challenges your soul. For me, it all began on a quiet November evening that I wouldn't have remembered otherwise. Within an hour, a shadow would intrude on my life that held me captive for decades. Life was peaceful, quiet, secure, predictable as I got ready to play at the local pool with my younger sister Susan, who was 7. Usually my mother stayed with us, but this time she dropped us off, knowing that the lifeguards were there to keep watch. We splashed around for a while, and then she challenged me to a race. I accepted, and we sped down the length of the pool. I had to beat her. Now, my sister was 2 years younger than me, but she was a lot more athletic than me, so I really had to prove my status as the older sibling, so I put everything I had into it. And then I got to the end of the pool, breathing heavily, looked around, and thought, she's in there yet, I won, this is great. But she wasn't there. Where was she? She should have been like right behind me. Had I really won? And so then I started thinking, well, maybe she was playing a trick on me. Maybe she got out of the pool and was going to be off on the side somewhere laughing. So I got out of the pool to go look for her. And as I walked down the length of the pool, I saw her on the bottom of the pool. Clearly this was not a game. I knew she needed help, but the lifeguards had not noticed her. Fear engulfed me because at that time, besides my sister being on the bottom of the pool, I was a very quiet child. I did not speak to adults or anyone in authority unless they talked to me first, but I knew that if I didn't say something, she would die. So I forced myself to go over and squeak out the words to the lifeguard, my sister is on the bottom of the pool. So he jumped into the pool and he reached down and he pulled her out, limp and white. Began breathing into her mouth. I gaped at the eerie white impressions that his fingers made on her face. And then the other lifeguard was leading me away, bringing me into the locker room to get changed. Alone and filled with fear, I cried out silently in prayer. Raised Roman Catholic, I knew how to pray, but this one just seized me, just with a depth of passion and connection that I'd never felt before. I shook the whole time that I dressed. As I walked out of the locker room, the flashing lights of the ambulance filled the entryway. Emergency workers asked me questions. Had she ever had seizures before? I didn't even know what a seizure was. I would know soon, though. My sister remained in a coma all that night, hovering between life and death. By morning, life had won, and she returned to consciousness. She returned home and life resumed as normal until a few days later, when she entered the house and collapsed in an epileptic seizure. If you haven't seen one, they're terrifying. She fell on the floor and started convulsing. More seizures would follow, and tests and medicine. And eventually, within a few months, her life would return to its previous routine, except for some daily medication and some minor restrictions. And my life would go back to its normal routine as well. But that was only on the outside, because life wasn't usual for me anymore on the inside. I now knew a secret. And it was a secret I wasn't ready for, and then again, whoever is ready. I learned that people I loved could be ripped from me in an instant. I didn't feel secure anymore. That stable life routine felt deceptive. Fear and anxiety seized me as intensely and shockingly as epilepsy had seized my sister. That fear directed itself in my life in a whole host of ways. I could appear normal, but I dreaded the 20 minutes that it took for my mother to drive to pick my father up from work every night and bring him home. What an accident. What if they die? I would have moments of panic at random times filled with visions of death and non-existence. What if I die? What if my parents or my brother or sister died? I came up with secret routines to kind of manage my fears, like avoiding the black lines in the pool. Or I would shake off the panic just by running or moving quickly. And though I pushed myself that one time to speak to the lifeguard in a time of crisis, it didn't get rid of my fears of speaking to adults or in groups of children. My parents probably should have sent me to counseling, but I kept my vulnerabilities hidden. I didn't share what was going on in my head. They had taught me well. In my family at the time, looking calm and well-adjusted mattered. We didn't admit flaws. This fear created a huge crack in my put-together self. I could look calm on the outside, but at times I felt terrified inside. Holding my fears inside allowed them to grow and to control certain aspects of my life. I was a very cautious teenager. I didn't take physical risks. I avoided amusement parks. I stayed far from the ledges when hiking. I was afraid of flying in airplanes. I learned to drive a year later than my peers and gripped the steering wheel tightly when I did. In my 20s and my 30s, I was an overprotective parent, trying to manage every risk for my children. Years later, I wrestled with anxiety when my teenage or young adult sons traveled across the country or went abroad. The September 11th plane attacks did not help any. Fear has disconnected me at times by putting up walls within myself when I avoid certain situations, or barriers between me and others when I overreact or cover up a panic response in ways that confuse people. The shadow side tends to disconnect us from ourselves and from others. Jungians use the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson as an example. Dr. Jekyll is a kind, respected professional man, but he has a big secret. He has shadowy desires that he lets out by drinking a potion and becoming the evil and deformed Mr. Hyde, a man with no compassion, no remorse, a man who begins killing people. These are two sides of the same person, but they appear as two very distinct people, and most people have no idea they're the same person. Dr. Jekyll keeps his transformations into Mr. Hyde secret. Eventually, Mr. Hyde destroys both of them. Jungians say that when we do not acknowledge our shadow side, it controls us and can even destroy us. If instead we face our challenges and learn to accept the tensions of opposites within ourselves, we can learn to integrate the undesirable qualities with the related desirable side. The process, though, can take a lifetime. Integrating our own less desirable qualities means acknowledging our faults and failings and our imperfections to ourselves and then sometimes to others as well, which can be a daunting task. We need to be able to accept these shortcomings as part of ourselves in order to work on them and manage them and overcome them. And then, even after doing substantial work on ourselves, it's sometimes hard to acknowledge that these challenges don't necessarily disappear. Sometimes they need to be continually managed. When I began to learn to surrender and to accept intense fear as part of me, rather than trying to deny it or avoid it, then that's when the healing could begin. When I could accept that I had the capacity to be both very calm and very centered in one moment and totally panicked and anxious in another, I could work on integrating the two and making something valuable out of both, rather than letting the fear destroy me. Oftentimes, a person's greatest obstacle links directly to what are or could become their greatest gifts. Like the broken pot that kept criticizing itself, I could see that my own flaws were, especially when compared with my sister, who was a daredevil, it was so easy to see them. It was much harder to accept and appreciate the gifts. Carl Jung said to confront a person with his shadow is to show him his own light. Once one has experienced a few times what it's like to stand judgingly between the opposites, one begins to understand what is meant by self. Anyone who perceives his shadow and his light simultaneously sees himself from two sides and thus gets in the middle, he said. And for me, this was true. In becoming conscious of death, I became conscious of life and of my vulnerability as a human being. I valued what was in front of me, knowing that it could end in an instant. And I also began to wrestle with questions about the meaning of life, to contemplate the place of human beings in the universe, to feel a connection with something beyond human existence. I became aware of choices and possibilities that I hadn't known existed before. I gained a lot of compassion. Ultimately, this led to ministry and to mental health counseling. When the coming-of-age group begins to face a personal challenge, I wonder if it will eventually lead to their own great gifts, or maybe to a life calling. I invite all of you to think about how your own flaws and failings have unfolded. How has life come to where it is for you today? Have your greatest challenges served you well over time, or are they still waiting to be confronted? And when you do confront them, what unexpected gifts might they release with the pain? My own gifts unfolded in the way that I faced my fear that led me to become a very centered person at my best moments. Because in order to face the fear, I really had to do some inner centering. Looking back, the times when I faced my own obstacle most effectively are those times when I learned to surrender. For me, surrender comes primarily in two ways. One is connection to something beyond myself, which I would name God, turning my fears over to God. And the other is through meditation and mindfulness, focusing all my attention on the present moment, releasing one by one the thoughts that flash through my mind about the past or about the future, and just being here now in this moment. Sometimes I use both tools in the same situation. I've learned to accept that no matter how much that I want to control all the risks and manage all the outcomes, I can't. My loved ones are vulnerable, and so am I. But I don't need to dwell on this. I can live in that tension. And I've learned other practical skills as well, like expressing my fear through music and through dance and through art and through rationally talking myself out of my anxieties. These kinds of tools might work for other challenges people have as well. But all of those are very important. They're all internal coping. And I've come to realize that it's also important to do more of an external coping. So another way of surrendering is by opening oneself up and letting one's failings and vulnerabilities show. So recently, I've done this in many ways, but recently I decided to challenge myself in another way to let my vulnerabilities show. So this coming-of-age group, it begins their year every year doing the high ropes course down at Camp Stelmarnus in Livonia. And they do some team building exercise. So I knew that as the chaperone, I could have kept my feet on the ground and said, no, I'm just going to watch on you guys. That would have been the comfort zone. But I decided I was going to push myself to not only face my fear, but to face it in front of people, because there was no way to do this without my fear showing. Although, I will admit that the week before, I actually imagined, because I had been so mellow and centered recently in life, I actually imagined I could do this high ropes course without feeling any fear. That did not happen. In fact, just watching the first youth climb up, like climb the ladder and then the little foothold things all the way to the top, just like I had this huge terror seize me, this like maternal urge to protect. I would like I have got to get all these people out of here and bring them back to safety. So I had to just look away, take a deep breath, and center myself, because I knew that was not the right thing. So that was before I even stepped on the ladder. So everybody else went up, and then it was my turn. And I did not go to the high level, but the mid-range level was high enough, tapped into every fear I have. Standing, so I climbed up the ladder and I was standing on the ledge, ready to release myself. I mean, you're hooked to harnesses, but they look pretty flimsy to me. So, so I stepped on that first wire, shaking. I mean, really, really shaking. Starting to walk, and the whole wire was shaking, and I'm like, I don't know why I am doing this. But I thought, okay, I've made this challenge. I have all these young people here. I can't turn around, although I did consider it several times. But they encouraged me, and I did make it across that first wire without dying. And then I didn't do the whole course, but I did do 2 more sections after that. So the second little section, I decided to, I wasn't going to look down at all. I just focused on that mindfulness, being present in the moment, putting my foot in each of the ropes and going across. So I did face that, and in a visible way where people could see my fear. One of my biggest learnings from facing my obstacle a couple weeks ago is that my fear will never go away, no matter how much I've worked on myself, how relaxed I've become in various settings compared to how I was even 10 years ago. That monster can always be drawn to the surface. And so I always have to be managing it. These concepts of naming and facing deeply entrenched obstacles, they can be applied to society as a whole as well. The shadow side of our American society has come out of the dark mud and the cold snow of the hidden reaches of our institutions and relationships into full force in the past few years. It's ugly. Racism, sexism, hatred, violence, self-interest, lack of compassion, police absolved of violence against blacks, families torn apart through deportation, institutional racism in our own UUA, mass shootings and not enough gun control, lack of funding for mental health services. It's frightening beyond some of my own personal worst fears, and that says a lot. But these shadows aren't new. They've been hidden from view for centuries in many ways. So, as a society, we must continue to expose and to face these cracks in our society. And that's really important, but the deep, transformative societal work can't take place unless more and more people are willing to do their own personal work. Individuals can't join together to face and to embrace and to transform the shadow side of American society until we're willing to face and transform our own personal demons. When I engage in my own work with fear, I realize that I live in a suburban neighborhood in large part because I feel safe there. When I first moved to Rochester 4 years ago, I rented a house in a city neighborhood. And when I heard noises in the night, I would imagine people breaking in. Part of it was definitely my own issues, but it also was a neighborhood with a lot more crime and closer to the highest crime areas in the city, far closer to crime areas than the house I'm in now. I've had clients come to my counseling practice who've actually had their homes broken into at gunpoint and did not have the ability to move somewhere else, as I did. I have the privilege of facing my fear on the relative safety of a ropes course, rather than facing and managing it on city streets. It's much harder to do that inner work when one's life is truly in danger. We can't change society until we are able to connect our own obstacles to the choices that we've made in life, and then name how that relates to and affects society as a whole. haven't wrestled with how to transform our own souls and opened our own vulnerabilities to others, we can't really transform society as a whole. And that is why this deep and painful work matters. If you won't begin the personal work for your own benefit, begin it so that you can join in doing the deep healing work in our society. And if you have already begun it, try moving it to the next level by sharing your vulnerabilities, maybe inspiring another person to new ways of facing their own challenges. By facing our personal obstacles and by sharing with at least one or two others, we join in living out our sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.